How does Matthew prepare his readers for his passion narrative? Well, there are obvious ways. Matthew, like Mark, of course, features several explicit predictions of the passion by Jesus. Now, these are pretty obvious in the text. I'll leave it to you to find these on your own, but there's also a number of what we might consider implicit passion predictions as well. For instance, in Matthew 9:15, Jesus says, when he's criticized for the disciples not fasting, he says, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? However, the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and when that happens, they will fast." Again, Matthew 12:40. This is after the request for a sign. Jesus replies, "You're not getting a sign. Actually, the sign you're getting is a sign of Jonah, who was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, and so also the Son of Man shall be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth." And they get the parable of the wicked tenants. Now, of course, this is all about the killing of the landowner's son by these wicked tenants, and it's hard to read that in a way that doesn't foreshadow and make us think of the passion of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who's the ultimate landowner. And now the Gospel of Matthew also has lots of anticipations of the passion as well that are a little bit more subtle. Now, we've remarked several times that there are a lot of parallels in Matthew between John the Baptist and Jesus. The first time we noted this was looking at their preaching and teaching. Their messages about the kingdom of heaven being at hand, the command for the trees of the kingdom, that is you and me, to bear good fruit and not bear bad fruit, the coming of the separation of the wheat and the chaff. You know, the wheat, the good wheat gets gathered in the barn, the other one thrown away and burned. Observe the teachings are the same between Jesus and John the Baptist, but also look at the way that the deaths of the two men are portrayed. If you think of Jesus' death, then think back to John's. Look, both of them are put to death by a ruler. Herod in John's case, Pilate in Jesus' case. John got arrested. This is by the way, in Matthew chapter 14, and he was bound up, tied up, just like Jesus was arrested and bound. Herod, if you recall, was reluctant to put John to death because the people held him to be a prophet. But the scribes and the Pharisees were also reluctant to arrest Jesus for exactly the same reason. The people held him to be a prophet. Herod was reluctant to put John to death, but did so under pressure from others, his wife and her daughter. Same deal with Pilate. He didn't really want to put Jesus to death either, but he gave into the pressure that others were putting on him. John the Baptist was buried by his disciples after he was dead, and of course Jesus was too. So you see here the parallels between the Baptist and Christ are seen, not only in what they did and what they preached, but how they died. Now, the Passion is also foreshadowed in a different way by Matthew. For one thing, it gives Jesus a chance to demonstrate, to showcase some of the harder moral teachings he proclaims earlier in his gospel. For instance, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus counsels his disciples to pray, "Thy will be done." And of course, that seems like an easy one to pray to the God the Father, until Jesus himself says it in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before he's to be executed, telling God the Father, "Thy will be done." Jesus tells us, "Blessed are they who are persecuted for righteousness' sake." Now, here, the Greek term for righteousness also carries a sense of innocence. But Jesus himself in the Passion is condemned to death as a righteous or innocent man. This is in Matthew 27:19 and again in 24, both by Pilate's wife and then by Pilate himself. Jesus also counsels his disciples to turn the other cheek when they are struck. And sure enough, when Jesus is struck in Matthew 26:67 and again in 27:30, he offers no resistance at all. There are even some little noticed subtleties in Matthew concerning Jesus' doctrine and the practical application of that doctrine, or the lack of it, by other characters of the story, particularly how it plays out in the Passion. Now, if you recall in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches that if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. This is in Matthew 5:41. But the word force, angereurein in the Greek, has but one other appearance in Matthew's gospel. And that's when Simon of Cyrene is forced to carry Jesus' cross. This is in Matthew 27:32. Simon thus stands out as an exemplar of the principles announced earlier in the Sermon on the Mount. The same principle works in reverse too. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount specifically condemns swearing of oaths. Okay, in the context really of backing up casual speech. You're not to swear oaths as followers are to let their yes be yes and their no be no. This is in Matthew 5:31. But this makes Peter's denials of Jesus all the more blameworthy since they were accompanied by false oaths. In Matthew 26:72, Peter denied Jesus, and not just denied him, but he denied him with an oath. And that's not all. 2 verses later, Matthew tells us that Peter began to kathamatizein and omnuein, to curse and to swear. And that doesn't mean he said some cuss words, and not even sure what the Aramaic cuss words were back then. And it also doesn't mean what the RSV translates it, that Peter cursed himself and swore. No, what Matthew's telling us is that Peter cursed Jesus in the hopes of saving his own life, trying to distance himself from his Lord and Savior. Fear of suffering and death really brings out the best and the worst in people, and you see how Peter ended up. Not only denying Jesus, but doing it in a way that specifically broke the specific moral guidelines laid out in Jesus' own moral teachings given earlier. Now, a good number of Matthew's doublets are not simple repetitions of basically the same material. They're really very artful compositional techniques to draw you, the reader, into a greater contemplative analysis of the mysteries. For instance, the Transfiguration account in Matthew 17:1-8. Now, this is traditionally said to have occurred at Mount Tabor. This is nearly the polar opposite of the death found in Calvary in Matthew's Passion narrative. Now, I say nearly because there are two similarities. In both Tabor and Calvary, Jesus is declared to be God's Son, and at both mountains do the onlookers fear exceedingly. But the contrasts are even more striking. Tabor is a private revelation. Calvary is a public spectacle. Jesus is glorified with dazzling apparel at Tabor. At Calvary, he's stripped naked and humiliated. At Tabor, there's a great light. At Calvary, there's darkness over the land. At Tabor, the Lord is flanked by 2 Old Testament heroes, Elijah and Moses. At Calvary, he's surrounded by criminals who revile him. At Tabor, he had 3 named male witnesses who fall on their faces in fear. At Calvary, 3 named female witnesses who look on at a distance. At Tabor, Elijah's present, while at Calvary, he's wrongly expected. Most importantly, God affirms Jesus at Tabor while he appears to abandon him at Calvary. Now, what does all this mean? Why these contrasts? I mean, this is some kind of neat, artful foreshadowing in the narrative of Matthew to, in some sort of mysterious way, prepare his readers for the Passion. Yeah, it's all that, but it seems to really draw the reader in, to force the reader to ponder the depths of Jesus' humiliation on the one hand, and the potential of the vision of his exaltation on the other hand.